December 19, 1944, stretched across three massive war theaters that covered 6 million square miles. American machine gunners submitted 47,000 after-action reports. What those documents revealed would overturn 6 decades of accepted military engineering thinking. The gas-operated machine gun, the established standard, the proven method, the design every expert insisted was superior, showed a 34% stoppage rate when used in actual battlefield conditions. Browning's recoil-operated guns achieved just 3.2%. Same ammunition, same soldiers, same war. One fundamental difference separated them. When John Moses Browning entered the U.S. Ordnance Department in 1900 carrying his prototype, the room full of experts immediately grasped what he'd attempted to do wrong. He'd designed a machine gun where the barrel moved backward with each shot, harnessing the recoil itself to power the mechanism. Mechanically flawed, the procurement record stated bluntly. It introduces misalignment issues, it accelerates wear, it compromises accuracy. Gas operation represents the accepted standard. They dismissed him. For 4 decades they continued dismissing him. Then came the frozen tundra of Alaska, the oppressive humidity blanketing the Pacific, and the thin air at 25,000 feet where European bombers climbed. These extreme conditions proved something the experts had never contemplated. The simplest design proved deadliest. Back in 1900, conventional wisdom carried such force and elegance. Machine guns should capture the expanding gases released when cartridges fired, using that energy to drive their cycling systems. Hiram Maxim had demonstrated this in 1884 with a recoil-operated design that Britain's army embraced. And by 1900, every major military power agreed on this principle. Siphon off some of that explosive force, channel it through a gas tube to a piston, harness that pressure to eject spent brass and seat fresh ammunition. The system appeared mechanically sophisticated, theoretically sound, and battle-tested from colonial conflicts. When John Moses Browning brought his prototype into the U.S. Ordnance Department's procurement office, with a design that contradicted every principle underlying this consensus, the officials assembled there possessed every legitimate reason for skepticism. Browning's concept seemed straightforward, almost primitive in its simplicity. Allow the barrel itself to slide rearward from recoil, use that backward motion to unlock the bolt, expel the spent cartridge, and recock the firing mechanism. Then let a heavy spring drive the barrel forward, stripping a fresh round from the ammunition belt and driving it into the chamber. Fire, unlock, repeat. The whole sequence consumed 1/10 of a second. No gas tube, no piston, no adjustment mechanisms, merely barrel, bolt, and spring. 3 essential moving parts performing what the gun naturally wanted to accomplish when it discharged. The procurement official's written response survives in official documentation with bureaucratic precision. Mechanically unsound. Barrel movement creates misalignment between barrel and receiver. It accelerates wear on locking surfaces. It reduces accuracy potential. Gas operation represents the accepted standard for automatic weapons development. Those technical concerns possessed merit. A moving barrel demanded more mass in motion, requiring heavier components to withstand the stresses. It required looser tolerances to accommodate that movement, which theoretically damaged precision. Fighting against this logic stood 4 decades of European precedent declaring that extracting gases represented the modern, sophisticated approach to automatic fire. By 1917, as American troops prepared sailing for France, the United States military sent 2 machine gun varieties into combat. The French Hotchkiss Model 1914 operated on gas, weighed 52 pounds, and fired 450 rounds per minute from its strip-fed magazines. The Browning M1917 employed water cooling and recoil operation, weighed 103 pounds with its water jacket and tripod, yet matched that same firing rate. Army procurement documents pointed to the weight difference as proof of gas operation superiority. Recoil operation demands excessive mass to withstand mechanical stress, the analysis concluded. This represents inefficient design philosophy, unsuitable for modern warfare's mobility demands. What those procurement documents overlooked was what Browning had learned during 2 decades crafting firearms in his Utah workshop. Gas-operated guns demanded additional components that recoil systems eliminated completely. A gas tube channeling pressure from the barrel, a piston converting that pressure into mechanical action, adjustment screws regulating gas flow for different ammunition or environmental conditions, seals preventing gas escape. Each represented a failure point where fouling accumulated, corrosion formed, or impact damage could disable the entire weapon. Browning's recoil system used the gun's own mass and momentum as its operating force. It was mechanical judo, redirecting existing force rather than creating new force. When Browning died in 1926, the firearms world responded respectfully yet revealingly. Obituaries celebrated his lever-action rifles and pump shotguns, but treated his passion for recoil-operated automatic weapons as an interesting sidetrack rather than his central contribution. The British trusted their Vickers guns refined from Maxim's original gas-operated design. The Germans were crafting the MG-34, which employed recoil operation, but with such mechanical complexity, it required 150 individual parts. The Americans protected their institutional interests by maintaining production contracts for both gas and recoil designs without fully committing to either philosophy. By 1941, American factories manufactured 4 different automatic weapon types in enormous quantities. The M9919, Browning in .30 caliber, cost $667 per unit, with 42 parts inside. The water-cooled M1917 Browning cost $2,165 and contained 45 parts. The M2 Browning in .50 caliber, Browning's recoil design enlarged for aircraft and vehicle mounting, cost $2,100 per gun with 44 parts. The competing Browning automatic rifle, which employed gas operation for weight reduction, cost only $309 but needed 87 parts to operate. Nobody yet possessed definitive proof showing which design philosophy would prevail where battle truly mattered, amid mud, blood, and relentless combat. Procurement debates persisted in Washington offices and ordnance proving grounds, technical arguments trading theoretical advantages like incoming artillery. Gas operation delivered weight savings and reduced recoil felt by gunners. Recoil operation provided mechanical simplicity and fewer precision components requiring maintenance. Gas systems could be adjusted for various ammunition types. Recoil systems needed no tuning. Each side cited European precedents, metallurgical studies, and ballistic calculations supporting their position. Neither side possessed comprehensive field data from genuine combat testing reliability under real conditions. December 7, 1941, transformed this debate forever. When Japanese planes attacked Pearl Harbor, every theoretical discussion about engineering elegance became irrelevant. Within 72 hours, American forces from the Aleutian Islands to the Philippines faced combat carrying whichever automatic weapons their supply lines had issued. Some carried gas-operated BARs, some carried recoil-operated Brownings. None considered procurement philosophy or engineering consensus meaningful. A single brutal question consumed them: which gun would maintain fire when everything else, training, tactics, logistics, leadership, collapsed? The largest uncontrolled comparative test of automatic weapons design in military history commenced. Across 6 million square miles from Arctic tundra to Pacific jungles to North African deserts to European farmland, American soldiers became unwilling test subjects. The question was deceptively simple. Which design principle, gas operations' sophisticated energy extraction, or recoil operations' primitive momentum redirection, produced more reliable, sustained fire under severe conditions? The answer would emerge from stoppage rates, maintenance logs, and after-action reports filed by men whose survival depended on choosing correctly. Attu Island in May 1943 became where physics began defeating theory. This westernmost American territory lay suffocated beneath fog so dense that visibility diminished to 100 feet, with temperatures staying around 28 degrees Fahrenheit, while wind gusts reached 45 miles per hour. Japanese forces held the high ground across tundra that gripped soldiers' boots and transformed every uphill assault into exhausting agony. American soldiers, many conscripted from warm southern states, carried 3 automatic weapon types into that bitter engagement. M1 Garand rifles at 9.5 pounds, Browning automatic rifles at 19.4 pounds, and M9919 Brownings at 31 pounds. Within 72 hours, the island would render its judgment on which design philosophy withstood extreme cold. The third day dawned with temperatures that had plummeted overnight to 19 degrees. Fog pressed against the slopes as assault squads readied for attacks against Japanese positions. 214 bars had been distributed to these units specifically for their automatic capability, combined with portability compared to heavier tripod-mounted Brownings. By 11 a.m., 89 of those rifles had stopped functioning completely. The culprit was ice accumulating internally. Soldiers understood keeping visible frost from mechanisms. The true failure happened deep within the gas system itself, where moisture from gunners' breath and the weapon's own heating cycles froze solid inside the narrow gas tube, powering the entire operating mechanism. The physics proved devastatingly straightforward. Gas-operated weapons employed a small opening drilled into the barrel, bleeding off high-pressure gases from fired rounds. These gases traveled through a tube measuring roughly 0.177 inches in diameter to drive a piston, cycling the action. That constricted tube, combined with the relatively low pressure making gas operation elegant during warm conditions, created ideal circumstances for ice formation in sub-zero temperatures. Any moisture entering the system, and moisture always penetrated through condensation, could freeze across that narrow opening. Even partial blockage reduced gas flow sufficiently to cause short stroking, where the bolt failed traveling far enough rearward to expel the spent case and chamber a fresh round. The weapon became a bolt-action rifle requiring manual operation, assuming the frozen gas system hadn't completely seized the piston. Thawing a frozen BR demanded 15 minutes beside a field stove to warm the gas tube, followed by meticulous reassembly while wearing gloves thick enough preventing frostbite, yet thin enough for manipulating small components. In combat, 15 minutes stretched into forever. The squad leaders stood frozen, watching in disbelief as the heavy automatic fire support they'd counted on simply vanished at the precise moment when Japanese counterattacks came driving through the thick fog. Soldiers gripped their frozen machine gun receivers, the bars becoming useless chunks of metal in their hands. They fell back on what they had, M1 rifles and bayonets, pushing forward up the slope with whatever weapons would still function. Meanwhile, the M1919 Brownings kept hammering away relentlessly. Back at the armory, the maintenance records from the Attu campaign told a remarkable story. Across 2,147 recoil-operated guns in the field, only 41 stoppages were documented. The failure rate was so astonishingly low that officers at first wondered if soldiers were even reporting problems honestly. But the technical reality behind the numbers explained everything about why these older Brownings outperformed the newer, fancier gas-operated designs. The recoil-operated system worked through pure mechanical violence. Every single shot sent the barrel slamming backward against massive spring tension. The bolt snapped open with tremendous force, hurling spent shell casings 15 feet into the snow. Then the spring crashed everything forward again, stripping a fresh round from the belt and slamming it into firing position. This wasn't elegant engineering, it was raw mechanical brutality happening thousands of times per minute. And here's the thing about that brutality. It was incompatible with ice. Whenever moisture found its way into a Browning's mechanism, the next shot's recoil energy simply expelled it. The gun's heavy mass and those powerful springs generated kinetic forces measured in hundreds of foot-pounds, enough to shatter any ice crystals trying to form on the moving parts. Gas-operated weapons, by contrast, relied on capturing a small portion of available energy and channeling it through narrow passages. Ice loved those narrow passages. Recoil operation used the gun itself as a battering ram that destroyed fouling through sheer mechanical force. It was like trying to push a needle through your frozen fingers versus hammering a nail straight through a block of ice. Sergeant Thomas Doyle of the 7th Infantry Division grew up on a Wisconsin farm where his father had taught him one lesson that stuck. Any tool that froze could become a killer in the winter months. Doyle had kept detailed maintenance logs since his training days because he understood that metal behaved differently when temperatures plummeted. His M1919 A gun he'd nicknamed Bertha, with straightforward affection, developed particular quirks that he documented carefully. In freezing weather, she performed better with slightly looser headspace because the cold contracted metal enough to require adjustment. She needed extra oil on the buffer spring since standard lubricant turned into useless paste. Most importantly, she ran better nearly dry than the bars ran with proper lubrication, because that violent recoil action didn't require slippery surfaces the way gas-operated systems did. By the time American forces secured Attu in late May, the casualty figures included losses that had nothing to do with enemy bullets. 89 soldiers had fought their way uphill with semi-automatic weapons after their bars had frozen solid, facing Japanese machine guns that kept firing from defensive positions where the attackers couldn't use the terrain. The after-action reports noted this clinical observation. Bar reliability under Arctic conditions was insufficient for sustained automatic fire support. The recommendation was immediate: reissue M1919 Brownings to all assault elements. Within 2 weeks, the recoil-operated Brownings were distributed to every frontline squad under Alaska Command, while the gas-operated bars were sent to reserve units stationed in warmer climates. Doyle wrote a letter home in June, using plain language of someone who'd watched textbook theory collide with brutal reality. "The Brownings were ugly," he wrote. "They were heavy as sin. They were loud enough to deafen a person. But when your bar froze solid and the Japanese came charging uphill through the fog, that ugly 30 caliber gun became the most beautiful thing you'd ever laid eyes on." His maintenance logs filled page after page with precise temperature readings, stoppage causes, and comparative reliability data. The reports reached Washington by July, and the Ordnance Department responded with bureaucratic caution. This was an isolated incident, they said. Arctic conditions weren't representative of standard operational theaters, but the Brownings trial was far from finished. That recoil-operated design that had survived the frozen North was already being deployed across every climate zone where American forces fought. The next testing ground would prove even more demanding than Attu's ice. The Pacific Theater's humidity, heat, and salt-corroded air were about to deliver their own harsh judgment on whether simplicity or sophistication survived where survival actually mattered. Humidity, it turned out, could be just as deadly to automatic weapons as Arctic cold. Island warfare from Guadalcanal to the Philippines exposed firearms to conditions that transformed engineering elegance into fatal weakness. Temperatures soared between 90 and 105 degrees Fahrenheit. Humidity levels hovered between 85 and 95%. Salt air carried microscopic corrosive particles that worked their way into every crevice and gap in mechanical assemblies. Marine Armory crews discovered that even freshly cleaned and properly oiled bars would develop internal corrosion within 48 hours of exposure to island air. Gas-operated weapons with their narrow tubes and precision-fitted pistons became breeding grounds for rust. New Georgia Island in July 1943 became the setting for an unplanned experimental comparison that would completely reshape American automatic weapons doctrine. The 43rd Infantry Division landed with 412 M1919 Brownings, 289 bars, and 156 M1 Garands. All three fired the same 30 caliber ammunition, all faced identical environmental conditions, and all received the same maintenance from soldiers with comparable training. After 12 days of relentless combat in 94-degree heat with constant rain, the operational numbers told a story that procurement officials in Washington couldn't dismiss as merely an anomaly. 397 M1919s remained operational, a 96.4% functionality rate. Only 15 had been removed from service for parts replacement, mainly worn buffer springs and cracked feed plates from sustained heavy fire. 177 bars were still working, a 61.2% rate, while 112 sat out of commission. 78 of those failures were caused directly by gas system corrosion that blocked or restricted the narrow tube connecting barrel to piston. 141 Garans remained operational, an 89.7% rate, with 30 rifles out of service due to gas system fouling that caused short stroking. The technical reason was straightforward. The Browning's supposedly primitive design dominated under tropical conditions because gas tubes on the bars and M1s had internal diameters barely 1/6 of an inch. A single pinhole of rust could block 40% of gas flow. The high-pressure gas moving through those tubes carried moisture and carbon residue that deposited on internal surfaces. In that humid tropical air, the residue absorbed atmospheric moisture and formed corrosive compounds overnight. Even meticulous cleaning couldn't prevent the microscopic pitting that gradually strangled gas flow until the weapon failed to cycle properly. The M1919's recoil mechanism used components that were bigger, heavier, and deliberately overbuilt for punishment. The bolt alone weighed 1.8 pounds and was driven forward by a spring compressed with 90 pounds of force. Those massive parts didn't care about surface rust or minor pitting. The bolt's momentum and the spring's violent power overcame friction that would stop a gas piston dead. Where gas operation required channeling pressure through narrow passages that demanded obsessive cleanliness, recoil operation simply hammered through contamination with pure mechanical force. Corporal James McWilliams of the 164th Infantry had been a bank clerk in North Dakota before enlisting, and he brought an accountant's compulsive attention to detail into jungle combat. His waterproof notebook contained entries that would later become primary source material for post-war reliability studies. Every weapon stoppage, cleaning interval, and parts failure was recorded with the same methodical precision he'd once applied to lone applications. His August 15th entry from 1943 captured his approach perfectly. Bar number 7738. Removed gas plug. Discovered green corrosion blocking approximately 70% of tube diameter. Reamed clear with cleaning rod. Weapon functioned for 47 rounds before seizing again with short stroke. Swapped for M1919, number 42891. Fired 2,400 rounds across 4 days with 0 stoppages. Gun exterior shows heavy wear and surface rust, but continues cycling normally. McWilliams had learned on Guadalcanal that reliable weapons meant the difference between living and dying. His entire squad had been wiped out during the first week except for him and the M1919 gunner, an experience that convinced him weapon documentation was more vital than any other record-keeping he'd ever performed. His 18-month maintenance log covered 47 different weapons across the New Georgia and Philippines campaigns, revealing patterns individual soldiers could never detect. M1919 stoppages clustered around ammunition problems, bad production lots with inconsistent powder charges, corroded belts causing feed failures, or damaged cartridges that wouldn't extract. Bar stoppages clustered around the weapon itself, gas system fouling, recoil spring fatigue, and extractor breakage from the additional stress of functioning through reduced gas pressure. The pattern pointed toward a fundamental design truth that procurement theory had completely missed. Gas-operated weapons introduced complexity in exchange for theoretical advantages that evaporated under field conditions. The weight savings of gas operation, a 19-pound bar versus a 31-pound M1919, became meaningless when the lighter weapons spent 60% of combat time awaiting repairs. The reduced recoil felt from gas operation was irrelevant when the gun wouldn't cycle. The elegant engineering of capturing barrel gases turned into a fatal flaw when tropical humidity transformed those narrow passages into rust-producing chambers. In October 1943, Marine Corps Gazette published an article titled "Automatic Weapons Reliability Under Tropical Conditions." It represented the first official acknowledgement of recoil operations superiority when combat conditions tested design philosophy at scale. The conclusion was worded carefully but unmistakable. Comparative field data demonstrates that recoil-operated crew-served weapons achieve significantly higher operational readiness rates than gas-operated designs in high-humidity environments. The recommendation followed: prioritize recoil-operated machine guns for Pacific theater deployment. Army Ordnance responded with calculated subtlety, quietly revising procurement priorities without admitting that decades of gas operation consensus had been fundamentally wrong. Gas-operated designs would continue for rifles where individual soldiers needed portable weapons they could maintain between engagements. But for machine guns, crew-served weapons, where reliability meant life and death, where sustained fire support determined whether assault succeeded, the Browning's recoil system became the institutional standard. The change happened through production schedules and supply requisitions rather than official declarations. But every combat unit in the Pacific watched their weapon allocations shift toward guns that kept firing when everything else ceased. The M2 Browning represented recoil operation scaled to its ultimate extreme. Chambered in .50 caliber and weighing 84 pounds without mount or ammunition, it fired half-inch rounds at rates between 450 and 550 per minute, with effective range exceeding 2,000 yards. By mid-1944, the 8th Air Force was flying 1,000 bomber raids over Germany, and each B-17 Flying Fortress carried 13 M2 Brownings positioned across waist stations, tail turrets, ball turrets, and nose positions. That meant roughly 7,800 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition per aircraft, and 13 independent firing positions that needed flawless operation at 25,000 feet, where temperatures dropped to 40 below zero and oxygen levels required crude breathing masks. Luftwaffe pilots began reporting something unexpected in their combat debriefs. American gunners sustained fire longer than German gunners in comparable defensive situations. What puzzled German military analysts was straightforward. Both sides had received comparable training and access to roughly similar ammunition stocks. Yet the disparity in effectiveness persisted. The source of the problem wasn't about supply chains or instruction methods. It came down to engineering. The Luftwaffe equipped their bombers with MG-131 machine guns, firing 13mm rounds. These operated on recoil principles similar to Browning's American designs, paired with MG-151 cannons in 20mm caliber that used gas operation to generate greater destructive force. When the MG-151 performed, the results were terrifying. But Luftwaffe maintenance records told a different story. During continuous fire at high altitude, these cannons jammed between 8 and 12% of the time. The gas system overheated, choking under the extreme conditions above 10,000 feet. American B-17 gunners submitted 23,000 combat reports spanning January through June of 1944. During those same months and engagements, the M2 Browning stopped firing just 2.1% of the time. The mechanical answer revealed everything. Browning's recoil mechanism thrived where sophisticated engineering failed. At altitude, with temperatures plummeting and pressure dropping and gunners firing long bursts to drive off fighters, conditions that should have broken machines, the M2 stayed functional. The gun's own violence kept it clean. Each shot created such powerful barrel movement, 3/4 of an inch traveling backward, that carbon buildup literally shook loose before it could accumulate and jam the mechanism. The design could fire 200-round bursts without needing cleaning, something gas-operated weapons simply couldn't manage. Those designs relied on narrow passages for their gas systems, and carbon deposits would strangle those tight spaces long before reaching that volume of fire. Technical Sergeant Robert Harper arrived at his B-17 position carrying the discipline of his Iowa upbringing. His father had been a Lutheran minister, and that faith in precision shaped everything Harper did. Before each mission, he spent hours with his waist guns M2s, taking them apart, studying every component, running cleaning rods through every passage. For him, mechanical excellence wasn't just military duty. It felt like moral obligation to the 9 other men flying with him. Other gunners watched his approach and learned. The waist position became an informal school where replacements, nervous teenagers fresh from stateside training, discovered that meticulous maintenance meant steady suppressive fire when German fighters closed in. Harper possessed an almost preternatural ability to diagnose weapon problems through pure mechanical intuition. In darkness, at altitude, wearing oxygen masks that made every breath labored and sheepskin gloves so thick they barely allowed finger movement, he could identify stoppages by their distinctive sounds and the subtle resistance he felt through the gun's frame. He knew instantly whether the jam was mechanical, ammunition-related, or debris in the belt. His record across 94 missions showed 0 M2 failures, a statistic that became whispered legend throughout the 91st Bomb Group. 3 separate fighter attacks succeeded only because Harper cleared jams that technically weren't his gun's responsibility. Damaged rounds, twisted feed trays, bits of metal lodged in ammunition belts. While other positions went silent and B-17s dropped from formation, his guns kept firing. He'd watched too many aircraft get picked off by fighters when defensive fire stopped at the critical moment. Harper understood viscerally that the margin between survival and becoming another funeral statistic came down to whether a gunner truly comprehended his weapon. Could he diagnose catastrophic problems in seconds while enemy fighters were within firing range? The M2's mechanical simplicity made this possible. 44 parts total: barrel, bolt, spring, feed mechanism. A gunner could master every component's function, every way it could fail. Complex gas-operated systems didn't permit that mastery. At night, between missions, Harper wrestled with questions that kept him awake. Could a man pray for weapons that kept on killing and still call himself Christian? Did maintaining killing machines serve God or betray everything his father had taught him? He eventually reached a resolution that quieted his conscience. Protecting his crew was the prayer that mattered. Keeping his M2 functioning was how he served both God and the 10 men whose lives depended on that defensive fire. That clarity carried him through missions where sustained firing heated his gun barrel until it glowed red-orange, and smoke rose from his gloves when his skin touched the metal. The M2 cycled through that punishment because its recoil system paid no attention to heat. Gas-operated mechanisms couldn't say the same. By early 1945, the air war over Europe had fundamentally shifted. B-17s flew in such massive formations that Luftwaffe fighters rarely committed to full attacks anymore. But ground combat revealed new complications that critics seized upon as evidence that Browning's design was becoming obsolete. The German MG-42 outpaced the American M1919 in pure firing rate. The MG-42 fired 1,200 rounds per minute using gas operation and engineering that required over 150 parts. The M1919 fired 400 to 500 rounds per minute with its simple recoil mechanism and just 42 parts. Washington procurement memos began arguing that the war had proven sustained volume of fire mattered more than reliability could ever matter. Modern combat demands suppressive firepower, the analysis stated. Mechanical simplicity cannot substitute for inadequate firing rates. The criticism gained traction among procurement officials in Washington offices who'd never heard an MG-42's distinctive tearing sound, never watched German gunners frantically trying to keep the weapon fed and operational during extended engagements. The high firing rate that impressed observers on training ranges became a genuine handicap in actual combat, where ammunition supply, barrel changes, and mechanical stress determined whether weapons remained operational through hours of fighting. Yet those realities resisted easy quantification, and institutional momentum toward complex, high-rate gas-operated designs was building again, just as it had before autocannon debates. Before New Georgia proved recoil design superior, before missions over Germany had settled the question. The final answer would require someone compiling combat data at unprecedented scale. In June of 1945, the U.S. Army Ordnance Department conducted the most comprehensive automatic weapons study military history had ever seen. 94,000 after-action reports from the European theater, the Pacific Theater, and the Mediterranean Theater were assembled, covering every significant engagement from Normandy to Okinawa. The study addressed 3 questions that had divided military engineers for 4 decades. Which design principle produced fewer stoppages under actual field conditions? Which system demanded less maintenance during sustained combat? Which weapons remained operational longer under continuous use? The data would either vindicate 6 decades of faith in gas operation or prove that Browning's recoil system, dismissed by the establishment, had been correct all along. The stoppage analysis measured failures per 10,000 rounds fired across all environments and theaters. The M9919 Browning recorded 8.7 stoppages per 10,000 rounds. The M2 Browning recorded 9.4 stoppages per 10,000 rounds. The Browning automatic rifle recorded 31.2 stoppages per 10,000 rounds. Captured German MG-42s, analyzed from battlefield recovery and Wehrmacht armorer interrogations, showed 18.9 stoppages per 10,000 rounds. The pattern was undeniable. Recoil-operated crew-served weapons outperformed gas-operated designs by margins ranging from 2 to 1 up to more than 3 to 1, depending on the specific comparison. The maintenance interval data showed even more dramatic differences. M1919s averaged 2,400 rounds between required cleaning that interrupted combat operations. Browning automatic rifles required cleaning every 800 rounds to maintain reliability. MG42s needed cleaning every 1,500 rounds according to Wehrmacht maintenance protocols. The answer was mechanical, not metallurgical. Gas-operated weapons accumulated carbon fouling in their narrow gas tubes and piston assemblies at rates that eventually strangled the pressure needed for reliable cycling. Recoil-operated weapons expelled fouling through the sheer violence of their own operation. Each shot's barrel movement and bolt impact shook deposits loose before they could build to critical levels. Operational lifespan measured how many rounds a weapon could fire before requiring major component replacement beyond routine maintenance. M1919s averaged 95,000 rounds before needing barrel replacement, bolt replacement, or spring replacement. M2s averaged 127,000 rounds before major parts failure. Browning automatic rifles averaged 42,000 rounds before their gas system components or operating rods required replacement. The data illuminated a fundamental truth about mechanical design under extreme stress. Fewer parts meant fewer places where failure could occur. Simpler mechanisms tolerated wear that would destroy complex systems. The report's conclusion, written in measured bureaucratic language, nonetheless represented a complete reversal of 60 years of institutional consensus. Recoil-operated designs demonstrate superior reliability across all environmental conditions due to reduced component count and increased mechanical tolerance for fouling, corrosion, and wear. Gas-operated systems offer theoretical advantages in weight reduction and felt recoil, but demonstrate higher failure rates under sustained combat use. The recommendation followed logically. Recoil operation should become the primary design principle for future crew-served automatic weapons development. Technical Sergeant Raymond Jacobs of the 1st Infantry Division had landed at Omaha Beach in the 3rd Wave on June 6, 1944. He'd watched nearly half his company torn down in 20 minutes of German machine gun fire that swept the sand in methodical, relentless patterns. That morning taught him an urgent lesson. The only honest way to honor the dead was to record exactly what happened without embellishment or mythology. He kept a meticulous journal documenting not heroics, but mundane details. Serial numbers, maintenance schedules, ammunition consumption, and the daily survival of machines under extraordinary stress. His M1919 carried serial number 44,827. That gun traveled from Normandy hedgerows to urban ruins in cities whose names he'd never learned to German towns along the Rhine, 11 months of continuous combat. The barrel was replaced twice after extended fire missions that left the rifling worn smooth. The buffer spring was replaced once after compression fatigue began affecting how quickly the gun cycled. The extractor was replaced 3 times from breakage caused by sustained use. But the bolt, barrel extension, and receiver, the core components of Browning's recoil system, never required replacement. Jacobs brought that gun home to Chicago and preserved it in his garage as a physical memorial to the 11 months that had kept him and his squad alive through impossible odds. Between 1941 and 1945, American factories manufactured 2.08 million M1919 Brownings and 400,000 M2 Brownings. 2.48 million recoil-operated machine guns total. Those weapons fired an estimated 12.8 billion rounds across every theater where American forces engaged the enemy. The documented stoppage rate across all platforms, conditions, and operators measured just 3.2%. No competing design, American, British, German, or Soviet, matched that reliability figure. The numbers represented more than engineering achievement. They represented the survival of soldiers issued weapons that functioned when nothing else would. The M2 Browning that John Moses Browning had designed in 1921 The gun that procurement officers had dismissed as obsolete in favor of gas operation remained in US military service for the next 100 years. Some M2s manufactured in 1933 were still operational in Pacific Shore batteries when the war ended, guns that had fired over 200,000 rounds each without catastrophic failure. Gas operation produced 19 major military designs adopted by various nations between 1900 and 1945. Browning's recoil operation produced 6 major military designs during that same period. By the year 2000, every gas-operated design from that era had been retired and replaced. The M2 remained in service. Browning died in 1926, believing that institutional inertia would forever prevent full acceptance of his recoil-operated designs. He'd spent decades watching procurement boards defer to European precedent and favor sophisticated gas systems over his mechanical simplicity. What he never witnessed was combat data from 3 continents, proving that his dismissed concept, using recoil instead of fighting it, created the most reliable automatic weapons military history had ever known. The genius wasn't in complexity, it was clarity. He'd recognized that every gun generates violent recoil energy, a force that engineers attempted to dampen or redirect. He'd simply asked what would happen if that force powered the gun itself. That question seemed mechanically impossible in 1900, yet it became the foundation of American automatic weapons doctrine for a century. The simplest mechanism, powered by nothing more than Newton's third law, outlasted every competitor because it accomplished one thing perfectly. It kept firing when everything else stopped.